Hey, Erin.
How's it going, Tim?
We watched the movie Fat Man and Little Boy for the podcast, which is about the effort to build the world's first atomic bomb, codenamed the Manhattan Project. You know, the more I think about it, Manhattan Project is a great codename. If it was used today, the Russians would just think it was another hipster cocktail bar.
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
Welcome to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and often nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear nonproliferation for a living. I'm joined today on the podcast by Erin Connolly, an associate program director at Girls Security and currently a master's student, and Kate Hewitt, a federal contractor at the National Nuclear Security Administration. Thanks for coming on the podcast, you all.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
These are the winners of the 2018 Leonard Reiser Award for having written the best article on Voices of Tomorrow in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. The article is titled, American Students Aren't Taught Nuclear Weapons Policy in School. Here's how to fix that problem. Now, is it by watching lots of old nuclear movies from the 80s? What is the solution to this problem?
Yeah, that'd probably work just fine.
I don't know if this movie would make the cut for it, but I think
No?
it's one way to go. Chernobyl did wonders, I'm sure.
No, so we prescribed more policy prescriptions focusing on getting high schools to adopt curricula that focuses on both present and past nuclear weapons policies, really just covering fundamental basics.
And just expanding beyond what I personally learned in high school, which was we created nuclear weapons in World War II, we dropped them, and that was kind of the end of the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to expand that, adding more nuance, and adding more of the current policy debate for today.
And you actually take these ideas on the road. You go to high schools and talk to students, talk with teachers. How has that experience been like? What's the reception been, and has that been helpful for people?
It's been really grounding for me personally because honestly, high schoolers ask the hardest questions because it makes you re-examine the fundamentals. And Kate and I went through this really long process of how do you condense the whole nuclear policy field into a 40-minute lecture and then adding time for Q&A, which was probably the best part.
Mm-hmm.
And so just really teasing out the very basics so that students had enough information to then engage with it in the way that they saw appropriate. And so we found the Q&A to be the most important part. And I personally also learned a lot.
Yeah, I totally agree. It was really interesting because I thought that we had parsed it out to what was pretty tangible to grasp, but then even in the very first presentation that we gave the first time we went to Richardson, Washington, my hometown, we gave 22 presentations in 4 days.
22, wow.
Yeah,
we lost our voices.
It was a lot. It was a lot. In hindsight, would have done it differently, but that's okay. But when we were, in our very first presentation, the teachers would ask us to sort of go over some of the concepts that we were talking about, like what is an intercontinental ballistic missile, and something that just seems like an everyday topical conversation that we have, even as folks who are new to the field. You have to break that down on a much deeper level, and it's a good learning experience for us to recognize this is why the public can't engage on this conversation, because we're, a few years into our careers, and we're still starting to just talk about these things like everybody knows what they are, but realistically, that's not the case for most of Americans, so we need to do a better job.
Did it seem like most people's entry point is pop culture, and that's kind of how they, as high school students, tend to learn about this, what a nuclear weapon is, and maybe potentially where we got it from in the first place?
I think it's definitely a combination of what they're seeing in pop culture or what's popping up on their phones and social media in little tidbits.
North Korea was a big concern because we were out there in May 2018. And that came up quite a bit because I believe in Fire and Fury. So I think that was also a big entry point where people were like, this is all we know, that they have them. And that's it.
I don't know if you had someone like yourselves talk to you about these issues when you were younger, but how did you all get into this field? Kind of before we get into the movie that we want to talk about today, well, how did you all end up starting your path and to ended up being sitting around this table talking about this?
My past actually directly connects to this movie. I'm from Richland, Washington, so my hometown is home of the Hanford site of the Manhattan Project. We produced the plutonium that went in the bomb dropped on Nagasaki in World War II. My great-grandfather moved our family, or his family, there specifically to work at the Manhattan Project. He was a mechanical engineer and was intricately linked with designing the core rods for the B reactor, and was one of the first people one of the people in the room at the B reactor the first time that it went critical, so the first time there was a plutonium nuclear reaction. And I grew up in this town that's, glorifies nuclear weapons in this kind of strange way. So my high school's mascot is a mushroom cloud. I worked at a nuclear energy facility when I was in high school. And my whole life has sort of just been surrounded by this weird memorialization, I guess, or something to nuclear weapons. Didn't know that I was going to end up doing that for a living. I definitely wasn't a science person. I loved policy. I loved politics. I loved the world. I thought it was fascinating, but I was not a science person. And just through sort of a series of roundabout ways where I kept having touch points again with nuclear technology in some strange way. I had an internship at MIT doing nuclear technology policy when I was in undergrad, and worked at a nuclear energy facility, as I said. And then when I ended up getting my master's degree, about 6 months in, I realized what I really wanted to do was look at the effects of WMD and international law policy. And through studying that, I realized what I really wanted to do was look at why countries pursued nuclear weapons technology and what made them keep those nuclear weapons after maybe the first reason that they initially pursued them was no longer relevant. So I started to study the factors that sustain a nuclear weapons program in different countries around the world, and thus ended up in DC, and here I am now.
Very cool. Erin, what about you?
So my route was a little more circuitous. I did not grow up near a Manhattan Project site, but I actually ended up doing a project on North Korea in high school and was fascinated with the decision to pursue nuclear weapons and what that meant, but had no inclination that I could make a career out of that. I actually went to college to be a teacher, and then took one education psychology course and was like, I will not be a teacher, and had that classic life crisis about what I was actually going to do. And I was taking this national security course, and we had to write a paper my sophomore year, and I had no idea to write on, and my professor said, you should write about Iran. And I asked, what about Iran? And he told me to Google it. And I did, and it was spring 2015 when they were but when they were really finalizing the JCPOA. And so I became fascinated with, again, the decisions to pursue nuclear weapons, what the value add was, the leverage the United States had, and just kind of the policy implications that surround these weapons that were incredibly destructive that I had learned nothing about, despite being 20 years old in college. And so that was really interesting, and I Googled internships because I had no idea. I was like, arms control internships, national security, because I just had no idea what the field was. And no one at my college could tell me. And so I thankfully landed an internship at the Center for Arms Control, and then I worked there for the past 2 years before leaving to pursue my master's.
And that's a great place to get your start in this field. And I think a lot of the great work you all are doing as well with girl security is a good opportunity for people to not have to just Google it, or not be lucky enough to, or I mean, I don't know, unlucky enough to be, born and raised kind of near a nuclear site. You give them people, particular women, the opportunity and the insights of like, here's how this field works, and what is some of the work that you do for that before we kind of get into the movie thing. I think it's good for people to know about this, at least to go to the website for resources and things.
So girl security is something that I wish we had when we started in the field, and their founder, Lauren Buda, has been really amazing in terms of creating this environment for girls and other women in the field to be empowered and to learn more about the national security space. And girl security focuses on teaching core competencies, so it gives you these frameworks to approach issues in national security or other fields that you may decide to pursue. And those core competencies are critical thinking, ethics, strategy, and logistics. There's programming in schools that are a lot like their modules. And that's when Kate and I are actually creating a nuclear weapons one. Right now there's national security ethics and things like that. There's a phase mentorship network, which is really nice. You replace with someone just one rung above you. And then we also do games and simulations. And so next week we'll be doing a simulation with 365 girls.
Oh, exciting.
On Syria. So stay tuned how that goes. But it's been really great to kind of ground these really abstract conversations with students, and they're more than capable with engaging with the material. And also for more emerging issues like cyber and emerging tech, they have a really unique perspective on it because they experience it so personally. And I think that's something we should pay more attention to.
That's great. Well, I don't know if on that curriculum will be this movie that we'll talk about, the Fat Man and Little Boy. But either way, I'm really excited that you're here. You're really one of the two experts I wanted to have talking about this. When you suggested, I want to do a movie on the Manhattan Project, on the history of the bomb, and I said, well, I've got a movie for you that should be good. It has one of the most stellar casts I've seen in a film, but most people don't know about this movie because it didn't do so well. It flopped. So we're talking about the 1989 Paramount Pictures movie Fat Man and Little Boy. This movie, according to Box Office Mojo, made $3.6 million on a $30 million budget. So, ouch. 47% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. So what we're going to talk about today are two really underlining questions. Is there something about the Manhattan Project that prevents it from being a successful movie, or was it just kind of a failure of execution? And based on the work that you do, what is the best way to teach and learn about this particular piece of very interesting history? So for people who haven't heard of this movie, let me just read the tagline from the movie poster. These little short advertisements. Usually they're short, like Aliens, it's, in space, they can't hear you scream. This one, it's pretty long because posters back then used to be pretty weird. In 1942, the United States secretly set out to build the world's first atomic bombs. They called them Fat Man and Little Boy. And the man they called on to get the job done was General Leslie Groves. Strong, brilliant, determined, willing to push human endurance to the limit, willing to bear the responsibility, the glory, and the blame. His mission changed the world. His story is the story of his times and ours. I don't know how they fit that on a poster, but it also doesn't really describe the movie. And again, I keep emphasizing the his. We'll get into that a little bit later in terms of what this particular focus they place on the story. Directed by Roland Joffrey, who is a pretty good director. He did The Killing Fields, which is, weirdly enough, the movie that my mom and dad went on their first date with. For some reason, they kept dating after that particular sad film. But he also did The Mission, which is a pretty good film as well. But he probably doesn't talk about this too much. He was the producer of that Super Mario Brothers movie. So quite a career, right?
Wow. Really been all over the place.
But we got some big people in here. We got Paul Newman as they previously mentioned, General Leslie Grove. We have Dwight Schultz as J. Robert Oppenheimer. People may know him as Murdoch, Mad Murdoch on the A-Team. A little bit different than the world's brilliant scientist. John Cusack plays Michael Merriman, who's a bit of a composite character, similar to Ulana from Chernobyl. Not exactly a real person, but kind of represents a good number of different scientists involved. But there is, we'll talk about later, a bit of a stand-in for a real-life scientist, but they probably didn't want to use that individual's actual name. Laura Dern's in it as a nurse that worked on the Manhattan Project, as well as cameos by people like Fred Thompson, Greg Clark, and Natasha Robinson. A lot of other famous real-life scientists pop in here and there, not like cameos, although some have them, but not the ones I'm mentioning. But Ed Teller, Enrico Fermi, Leo Szilard, and a bunch of others, but not some big ones. Like Hans Bethe is in here, and I thought that was kind of interesting because he's such a fascinating character. And then some other ones like Ernest Lawrence, who was involved in the uranium enrichment, but I guess he wasn't actually there. Also, no women scientists. Entirely devoid from this film itself.
Women in general were pretty devoid in the film.
So let's get into the plot of the movie here. If you haven't seen this movie from 89, 86, go out and watch it. It's available if you have Amazon Prime. You can stream it for free. I don't know that's how you all watched it, but Amazon's been pushing me to watch this movie for a long time, so I'm glad I finally got around to it. But as usual, spoiler warning, we're going to get into it.
A general named Rhodes, a scientist named Oppenheimer.
You got one job, Doctor. Give me the bomb.
Worlds apart.
I can do it without you. Well, if you do, and something goes wrong, let it go!
Brought together to change the world forever.
3, 2, 1.
Paul Newman, Fat Man and Little Boy, rated PG-13. Starts Friday, October 20th at a theater near you.
Who wants to start us off in terms of talking about kind of where we are at the beginning of this film? Erin, do you want to take the first crack at it?
Sure. So the film starts with General Leslie Groves being told that he's going to work on the Manhattan Project, which was not really his idea of contributing to the Second World War. He was looking a little bit more for some combat, and he was given a nice Pentagon cake, which is quite extravagant, and actually ended up smashing it in frustration. And so he was tasked with running the Manhattan Project, and he had to get the scientists who would see this new innovative idea forward. And I didn't realize it was Leo Szilard who was in the tub, because at the center we also have our sister organization, the Council for a Livable World, just started by Leo Szilard, and the tub tendency was left out of my education. So that was a good new fun fact.
That is really cool. Yeah, so he gets this Pentagon cake because the thing that he's known for before this was building the Pentagon. He had just finished. I don't think it had formally, say, opened, but it was like a soft open, like a soft open of a restaurant. The Pentagon was up and running. And here's what I got, a quote from his, for some reason I own his biography, which I think is called Now It Can Be Told or something like that. He says, I was probably the angriest officer in the United States Army when they told him about his new job. Men like to recall in later years what they said at important or possibly historic moments in their lives. I remember only too well what I said to General Stromville the day he told me that he would have to work on the project that would win the war. I said, oh, and he doesn't mention throwing a cake, but I imagine that expresses the sentiment pretty well. What he didn't want to be involved in this, what do they call it, a dead-end boondoggle? I
think, and it was really indicative of the tension between the military and the scientists that persists throughout the film, and the value that the scientists were really, from my understanding, interested intellectually in the possibility of this new technology, and the military is very interested in using it. Mm-hmm.
I thought it was really interesting. As we were watching the movie back and forth, Erin and I were sort of giving text messages hot takes on what was happening. I thought it was pretty interesting, this grappling that maybe wasn't explained all that well in the film, but definitely was an underlying point, that there was this duty to country, whether that could be as a scientist or whether you're doing that through boots on the ground. And I think, at the beginning of it, when Leslie Groves is fairly upset, it seems like this is the next task that he's been given, even though it ultimately has changed quite literally the world as we know it, that it didn't seem to him as, I don't know, maybe dutiful enough or strong enough to be standing up for your country during this war, doing this particular thing, as where
he
a lot
wanted
of
the theater assignment.
Right. As where many scientists, I think, felt the exact opposite, which is that they had the chance to contribute, fight for their country in this sort of strange way through science without ever having to leave the United States and put their own boots on the ground. And the way my parents and grandparents have described my great-grandfather is he saw it as a duty to his country to be a part of the Manhattan Project, and I think many people would have agreed with that.
Well, once General Groves finally kind of calms down, right, he takes that perspective and he goes and he meets someone that they said, you've got to talk to Leo Szilard. How does he meet him, right? You mentioned that, in a bathtub.
In here.
Szilard?
Szilard! General Groves, I was expecting you. Come in.
Forgive me. Sometimes I get stuck in here, metaphorically.
I've read this. Is it possible?
What I wrote is possible. Probably inevitable. Separate uranium-235, then arrange for two portions of the element to be brought together suddenly so that the resulting mass undergoes a spontaneous self-generating reaction. And if this was the epicenter of that explosion, all of Chicago you could see from here would disintegrate.
Hallelujah.
At the moment, all we have are theories, concepts, inspirations, inconclusive results.
If we can make this device, so can the crowds.
Yes. Germany has the scientific capability.
And General, we need leadership here.
I wish there was more of him in the movie. He's a Hungarian-German-American physicist who was, the person who really thought up the idea of nuclear chain reaction 9 years prior to this meeting at the tub. He fled Austria during World War I and then fled Germany during World War II. I think he hung out in London for a bunch because he was he just went to a conference and they were talking about nuclear, science, and he was like, wow, really, if we could just hit something with a neutron, how would that work, and how could you sustain a reaction? And he was crossing the street in London and pauses kind of right before he steps on the street, and just it flashes in his mind, right? That's the story that he tells, and he realizes, oh, we can actually do this if we create a supercritical chain reaction. Use a neutron, break up of an atom, turns out more than one neutron pops out of that, and then you got some sort of quick explosion and energy and all that stuff. He crosses the street, I think, eventually, and decides that even though he's, I think it's just part of this patriotism, or at least trying to not let Hitler get a bomb in the future. He realizes, okay, I'm going to, later on in his life, he advocated for nuclear arms reductions and arms control treaties and stuff. But at this point, he said, if we build the bomb and if everyone gets the bomb, then there's going to have to be a world government that gets created to manage this particular problem. He didn't imagine a world where two countries would have nuclear weapons and they wouldn't decide to put them under international control, right? He didn't meet someone yet like Leslie Groves who would think that idea was crazy. So in this bathtub scene, he describes what a uranium gun type bomb design. Groves thinks about it, like, oh yeah, this actually could work, and kind of runs out of the room before Leo is able to talk anything more about how he could help. And this one thing I wanted to note here is that from Leo's biography, which is called Genius in the Shadows, which I recently picked up, he says that the baiting of brass hats, which is like, trying to go after the generals, was one of Leo's self-proclaimed hobbies. He and Groves were at odds ever since the Army Corps of Engineers took command of the bomb project. I think, was it from their first meeting, the straight-laced and steady Groves had found Leo impetuous and rude. The conduct seemed outright subversive to Groves, and within a month he had ordered Leo transferred back to New York, and apparently he even tried to have him jailed and deported as an enemy alien. This was, he mentions later in the movie that he wished that he had strangled that man in the tub, and I think that was probably not that far from reality. They didn't seem to get along all that well. And also, apparently, the story about him being in the tub is real. The bio also says that Leo's favorite morning routine was soaking in the tub for an hour or two to dream up ideas and schemes he may ponder and proclaim throughout the day.
It's a good work environment.
Yeah. Different version of working from home, I guess.
Exactly. Working from the tub. So, Kate, we meet, Robert Oppenheimer and his wife, Kitty, dangerously driving, on their way, I guess, to meet Groves. How does this introduction between these two, I guess, the main stars, I guess, of the movie, how did that go?
Robert Oppenheimer, I actually didn't know that much about him and his wife. I didn't know that he was married even, so I had to do a little bit of background research on that as well. But yeah, so they go and they meet in the cockpit of a B-29, which is similar to the Enola Gay. And they have this conversation about the project. It's funny because they turn on the airplane, and so the folks outside in this like hangar have no idea what's happening. He takes it very seriously as they're having this conversation.
Groves loves his information security.
That's right. I mean, it was definitely a foreshadowing of some of the security that you would see later on at Los Alamos, I guess you could say. But Groves starts to have this conversation, and he mentions what's happening with the technology that has come up, and that he's been asked to lead the project, and that it needs to be done in sort of a secretive way, right? And this is going to be one of the biggest things that happens to military technology. They're going to need to find locations for it that happen away from big cities. He asks Oppenheimer to come on, and he talks about it later in the movie as well. He says there is no project without Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is the project. And
Groves wanted Oppenheimer, it sounds like, right? But maybe he wasn't his first choice, according to a couple of things I read. They wanted some other people, but they were either too busy with other things. Like maybe Ernest Lawrence could do it, but he was busy. He's the only one who can operate the cyclotrons in Oak Ridge, or maybe someone else. But no one had all of the skills. But a weird, like Oppenheimer, what was he known for? He was known for being a brilliant young, theorist, but not really someone who was heavily versed in like experimental sciences, which is really what you'd want to have when you're inventing a bomb.
Experimenting?
Yeah, but it sounded like he had all these good talents, so they were going to bring him on, despite some potential concerns about his pinkish background, his political leanings towards communist ideologies. He formerly dated someone, which we'll get into, who was an actual card-carrying communist, and they weren't. Rhodes is not the kind of guy who would look on that too fondly. But still, despite all that fact, he must have been a pretty smart guy if they're still willing to kind of take him on.
Yeah, I mean, it was my understanding of Oppenheimer as the selection to be one of the lead scientists on here that he was known as one of the most brilliant minds of his generation, and that that he was one of very few people in the United States that could actually do what they wanted this person to do, to come on and bring people together and think bigger and differently about issues. It is also interesting, in my opinion, that he is fairly young, all things considered, and in the nuclear field right now, we have an issue with bringing on the next generation and finding the next generation of brilliant minds. They quite literally handed over the keys to the world to this person who was fairly young, to all things considered. So it's
in his 30s, right? Or,
yeah.
Wow. Someone who's about to turn 36, I have not gotten this far in my life. Yeah, still time. The setting of the B-29 is cool, but I think in real life they actually met like on a train, which is, I like trains, but not an airplane skiff or anything.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're not allowed to even like bring most OUO documents and read them on the metro, so I don't know why you'd be like, oh, so we're going to build a nuclear weapon and we want you to run that situation. We're going to do that on a packed train from Chicago to New York City.
Yeah. But he decides, I think Oppenheimer's like, okay, I can do this. This general guy, but I could have him eat it out of my hands because he needs me to do this project. So I think he tells Kitty that, it's going to suck for a while, but I'm going to run the thing. And no one ever mentions that in the movie. Kitty also is a bit of an accomplished biologist as well, in her own right. I think she was involved in some parts of the project. She was helped out with like some of the blood transfusions and other things on site, but
not mentioned.
That was left out.
No, she was just mostly throwing house parties and things.
And being told by Leslie Groves that some women were courageous enough to be in the background, and she apparently was not one of them.
Oh.
So is there Mrs. Groves?
Yes, there is. And she has the courage to stay in the background. Some men are on the planet for a purpose. Mrs. Oppenheimer. A good wife recognizes that and is happy to smooth the way.
It was interesting the tension of how women were seen as like distracting the men and not really contributing anything to the broader project, when in reality women play such a critical role and were better than the men at Oak Ridge in creating the uranium needed because they were more accurate. And they didn't, it was really a really interesting study on that on Girls in Atomic City.
Yeah, they should. We'll get into it right at the very end, but the focus of this movie is pretty much heavily on Los Alamos.
Mm-hmm.
The next scene is, and Los Alamos is where they thought of how to actually build and construct the warhead, but they didn't make the material itself. That was done elsewhere. So the next scene we see is 1946, Los Alamos, New Mexico. Les Grove, he wants more information security, physical security, more guards, more ditches, more dogs kind of roaming around. Don't concern yourself with comfort. We're here.
Whatever goes on around here is privileged information, no exceptions. No wives, no barbers, no exceptions.
And he gets all the people together in a room, and he says, hey, look, we're here not to be comfortable. We're not here to think about stuff just forever. We're here to build a military weapon, an atomic weapon, which they call the Gadget, which is the real codename nickname.
You are not here to be comfortable. You are here to go beyond the theoretical, the speculative, the fanciful. You are here to harness your God-given talent, your mind, your energy, practical pursuit of one thing, a military weapon, nuclear one, an atomic bomb. Keep the muttering just a minimum, gentlemen.
The Gadget sounds so,
innocuous.
Yeah, I have gadgets in my pocket. I don't. So this is when we meet John Cusack's character, Michael. He shows up to camp after a long trip, and there really is this fun interaction between him and, I forget the actor's name, but the guy who plays Dr. Cox in Scrubs. He also plays a doctor there, so he knows that role pretty well. Do you like Michael's kind of like the everyman character, even though he's a brilliant mind, he's our analog to the story and everything. Do you like Michael? I think he writes in his journal a lot, lots of narration. He might be the only one that actually does narration. He
was one of my favorite characters, actually, in the movie. I think the movie tried to do as historically accurate description as possible of the Manhattan Project, which we can talk about later because I'm not positive that was true. But they took some artistic licensing in bringing on these composite of a person, and they did so with Michael. And I think one of the things that's interesting about it is the dialogue that you see happen between him and Nurse Kathleen throughout the show.
Laura Dern.
Yeah, it's the first part of the movie, or the only part of the movie, where I think there's this like internal ethical dialogue between whether or not what they're doing is right or wrong. And I'm sure that there were plenty of people who were having that conversation with themselves, maybe internally, maybe with other people, pretty regularly throughout the creation of the nuclear weapon across the United States, of the people who knew what was happening, not just at Los Alamos, obviously. But I think they do a good job of capturing it with his particular character. He's one of the more likable characters as well. So.
One of the few, really.
Yeah.
He was more he's definitely more relatable than the other characters, so I think he was good at humanizing them. But I thought, actually, a little bit in contrast to the humanitarian impact discussion, like the cost benefits of the project, he, I think, covered it a little bit, and then we saw a glimpse of Oppenheimer's pro-con list at the end of the film, and I was kind of surprised that there wasn't more dialogue around that, because I think there was this big question of what do you do with this technology, and the scientists were saying just test it, don't drop it. The military was like, we should drop it. And like, to what end were they each serving? And I think, especially if you're talking about the movie in terms of educational purposes, I think that would have been a useful dialogue and tension to explore a little bit more deeply, particularly as these people are giving up their whole lives and their family are giving up their lives for this project. And if they're willing to say, like, all right, we're done, don't use it, even though we spent all this time and money, then, like, what does that mean?
Yeah, this was part of the pitch that Oppenheimer had to do when he would, went on his road show trying to recruit people, get the team together. He said in his biography about recruiting people to come work for the project, he says, the prospect of coming to Los Alamos aroused great misgivings. It was going to be a military post. Men were asked to sign up for more or less the duration. Restrictions on travel and the freedom of families to move about would be severe. The notion of disappearing into the New Mexico desert for an indeterminate period and under quasi-military auspices disturbed a great number of scientists. But there was another side to it. Almost everybody knew that if it was completely successful and rapidly enough, it might determine the outcome of the war. The sense of excitement, devotion, patriotism in the end prevailed. So it seems like it was even at the very beginning if you want to get someone to come out. It's hard enough for me as living out in Virginia to get people from D.C. to come out. Can you imagine what it was like to get people to move out to New Mexico? But again, there was a world war on, and people thought that this was something that could help with it. So the project's getting started. According to the movie, most of these debates and amongst the scientists would basically occur as someone walked angrily into a room while there were people yelling an argument in the darkness. And it sounds like where we are at the very beginning of the project. They have to divide up the work. They have to come up with the physics solution. How much material do we need? Do we do uranium-235 or plutonium? I thought it was interesting. They always kept saying uranium-235, but they never said the plutonium isotope. I guess the thought there was it's just going to be plutonium, so we don't care about what particular isotope it is. But it was funny how they specify that.
There's a lot of background in general about the workings of a nuclear weapon, and I actually watched the movie with my dad. As someone in the field, I had enough information to put it all together, but he was kind of like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah,
so do you think they did a good job explaining that?
They did not.
And the gun type device was briefly, it was 10 seconds, if anything, and the uranium, the plutonium debate was just so quick and just an overview, and I think you got the most information later in the film when there was the radiation accident where it was like, oh, this is really dangerous. But up until then, if you're not familiar with the subject, it was kind of unclear what was happening.
Yeah, the part where they're trying to figure out what the device will be, it has to be the right amount of size and the right amount of weight to get the right reaction, and how he squeezes the clementine, I think it's a clementine, in his hand, and then just in this moment of brilliance, I mean, I suppose that is how most good ideas come about, but that didn't explain anything.
Yeah.
And then he just ran into a house and was like, we know what we're doing now, and it's essentially implosion. I'm like, what?
Oh, yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Well, so that was Seth Niedermeyer. He was an American physicist who, for a long time, had been advocating an implosion design. So it wasn't like he just invented it. Finally, people were like, once they thought, oh, to make that work, it's going to have to be this heavy. We don't have anything that could do that. Right. I think the main problems they had was, in addition to the manufacturing of the nuclear material itself, which was all done in Oak Ridge or Hanford. So Oak Ridge was for the uranium. Hanford was for making plutonium. They had to figure out how to get that stuff together. They had a 19-month deadline. That's how much they figured it was going to take. And that's when their deadline was. So before that, they have to figure out, how do you make the deal with two main problems, right? The weight one, you mentioned, the gun barrel design, which whoever wants to explain that in their best way to someone who has no idea what that means, you have to solve that problem because the gun barrel is too heavy for it to work. Or pre-detonation, which means you want to get everything just right so that it's a good, sustained reaction for a short period of time. But if it's too fast, nothing actually ends up happening. So I think in real life, one of the ways they solved the gun barrel problem was, I've loved reading this. Their estimates for how heavy, I think it was 4 inches thick of steel for the gun barrel design, all of that was based off of what the military was telling them. For a gun that needed to be fired again and again and again, they realized we only need to do this once. So it doesn't have to be that heavy because it will fall apart as you explode it, but as long as it works. Why are we even talking about gun barrels to begin with? What's unique about this uranium design? Why are they talking about a gun barrel to begin with?
Its gun type is, you have the uranium here, of an explosion.
2 pieces of
uranium.
Yeah, and then
you shoot it.
Yes. Yeah, you're shooting them down the barrel so that they hit one another and create the chain reaction and create a nuclear explosion.
Right.
It's like a smashing thing. You're basically smashing it together.
I think it's like shooting a donut towards a peg so that it gets squished together and compact enough. Because if you just keep 2 pieces of uranium in a supercritical compact formula, because the reason why we're talking about compact, right, is the neutrons, if they have lots of open space, they're just never going to hit another atom. So you get them really close together. You surround them with reflecting material like beryllium and others, and that kind of keeps everything going. But you don't want to store it that way because it'll just go boom in your pocket.
Right. So I think,
right.
So the idea that they were thinking about how the chain reaction was designed initially, which was separating the atoms, and then once you collided them, that would create this supercritical chain reaction, and thus you would have something the likes of which we'd never seen before in an explosion.
Mm-hmm. And a good name for a podcast.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so you would have, the one side with its own separate mass over here, keeping itself from essentially having its own reaction, and the other on the other side, and then in the device you would shoot it at the other side, and that would cause the reaction, but it would keep it more secure to transport accordingly. And
they realized that they could only do this with the uranium.
Yep.
Which was an interesting thing, because they had to create a different design for the plutonium that they were using.
Plutonium was the fizzle problem, the pre-detonation. It has too much spontaneous neutrons that get popped out. So this gun design, that was the one that was used first. They never actually tested it. It was the one that was used against Hiroshima. Yeah, so that was the little boy design. But yeah, as you mentioned, they had to solve, what's another way to solve this problem of the weight, was they decided, we could either smash 2 things together, or we can take something that's like, say, the size of a basketball, and we squish it to the size of a golf ball. And how do we do that? You can either squish it like in your hand, but if you're not that strong, they'll do conventional explosives to be able to pop all that stuff together. So I think that's a fascinating description, and that becomes one of the main running problems is how do you go about and do that, because no one had ever thought that was something you needed to solve. Because you also have to do it pretty much, it has to be uniform. You can't squish more of it on one side, and that doesn't work all that well. As we're trying to kind of catch up and understand what's the science happening here, someone who's not like us that doesn't have the background in it, so certainly a lot going on. But the one thing we do get is we get the sense of the human reaction to the project itself. We know that Groves is making scientists pretty upset with all this information security, guard dogs, FBI investigations on the people's past, their censorship of their letters, and in particular, I know in real life a lot of the European scientists, because this is really a lot of the people here were formerly from Europe and had left during Nazi occupation. A lot of them didn't like the living situations, the barbed wire fencing and everything. It reminded them of concentration camps. Hans Bethe in particular was pretty upset at all of this, kind of given his background. It also affects Oppenheimer. He's on the phone with someone we mentioned earlier, the quote-unquote kind of card-carrying communist Gene Tatlock, who was someone he had had an affair with. I think it was still ongoing at that particular time period. He's on the phone with that person, says it's very sad that they can't meet up, but they probably can't hang out. His call gets picked up by Army intelligence. They want to kick him off the project, but Groves at least is backing him up, but he says, look, you have to stop this. You have to go and break up. And eventually they do, right? He goes to, I think, San Francisco, hangs out with his brother Frank, who movie doesn't talk about this. Frank, his brother, also heavily got involved with the bomb project later on. He was with Oppenheimer with the testing, the Trinity Test. But anyway, so he's with Frank. He hangs out with Gene one more time. They spend the night together, but then they break up. But so that's all happening. I think that's one of the better parts of the story, is at least describing a little bit more of a human side to some of the scientists, in particular Oppenheimer. But all while this is happening, right, we talked about the implosion device. It's not working all that well. They can't get the compression explosion to be uniform. There's some big accident at the test site, and I think this is where I found this particular, at least this made-up story, but it's an interesting story of accidents that are happening at the project. So I wanted to look into this. So someone, I think is an Army officer, one of the detonations goes off unexpectedly, so someone loses their legs, and Michael tries to save this individual, and he is able to, but also gets hurt a little bit. And this is where he goes to the infirmary. He meets Laura Dern's character, the nurse, Kathleen, and they dance a little bit. They're starting to form a little bit of a relationship, and I was wanting to look into it as it was real, because it's a dangerous, project. You get that many people together, eventually something's going to go wrong, right? I didn't find any example of any sort of implosion detonation accident. But Alex Wellerstein, I don't know if you guys have run into him yet. His blog is great. Was it Nuclear Secrecy? He went through using kind of declassified information, found out that there were 24 fatal accidents on the Manhattan Project. This was something he mapped out in 2015. He says around half of the 500,000 or so people employed by the project were employed in construction. As a result, most of the injuries and fatalities associated with making the bomb were construction-related variety. Heavy machinery, ditches, collapsing buildings. I'll just mention a couple of the examples, because this is interesting, because most people imagine, something goes wrong with the bomb project. It must be like a radiation-related incident, or the bomb exploded and people got hurt. But it was things like a bulldozer operator who had to build a town, had to build a road to go basically to nowhere. They had to build this thing so quickly, the bulldozer got crushed by a rock while he was trying to build this thing at night so they can get the road there and quick enough. And it's even incidents like a soldier who fell in a drainage ditch at night after drinking. There's lots of examples of that. 3 janitors had a little bit of a party, got drunk on wine that they mixed with antifreeze. But it's even sad things like, there were lots of families there. So there was a child who was on a canoe, age 10, and capsized and drowned. So there's lots of those incidents, but never anything about someone's leg exploding. But it's reflective, I think, of the danger that was involved in the project. Did your family ever tell stories, or? I
never heard of any hazards specifically related to that, to my great-grandfather working at the Hanford site. But two thoughts. First, it doesn't really surprise me. I think most of the time, even now with our own U.S. military, you do hear of people getting hurt from time to time on military bases or overseas or whatever, and I do think more often than not those things are car accidents or something going wrong with the test field, or somebody getting a DUI. Those are just life things that happen when you have 500,000 people working on a project in a condensed area. There are going to be accidents that happen that aren't always,
especially according to the movie, about 25% of the time people are spending in New Mexico, it's cocktail parties.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
There are more scenes of cocktail parties than there are, of people in labs in this movie.
Yeah.
Which is, good. It shows that they're people. They're not just, people who, they're not only wearing lab coats, they're also wearing cocktail outfits and things.
I wonder if all of the Manhattan Project sites were like that.
I think one thing that's interesting, so in Richland, Washington, I showed Erin this when she came home with me, but they have what are called the alphabet houses, and so they're still all there. I lived in an L house when I was growing up, but they were just the same, like simply manufactured homes where everybody who worked out at the Hanford site lived and was assigned to one of these homes. Some of them were duplexes, some of them were single-story, like family homes, but depending on your rank, you were given either an A, B, C, D, or whatever according house. And they still have them. So they're like these historical homes where you can drive through these neighborhoods. So in the movie, when they're talking about, setting up tents, and Leslie Groves is so annoyed that he has to like give housing to these people, that was in contrast a lot to what I had seen, because like I lived in one of these homes that somebody who worked at the Manhattan Project site at the Hanford site lived in. So
that's really interesting. The housing community I live in was made for civilians who are working at the recently opened up Pentagon. It is like that. Every house is pretty much the same from the outside. It still looks like it does. So here's where we're at in the movie. We're 8 months to the deadline. Oppenheimer, he likes Seth's idea of implosion design, but Seth just can't get that done. He's not his job, right? He thought of the idea. He squashed the clementine in his hand. It's not his job to build it.
Oppie, some way I have to focus the shockwave. Look at me! God, I'm running out of ideas!
This just sounds like an excuse for not thinking, Seth. If you can't do it, if you're out of your depth, tell me and I'll find somebody else.
No!
Yes.
Serber needs you back at the lab right now!
Oppie, you said it yourself, Seth. Focus. I know that somewhere there's somebody working on a way to focus an explosive shockwave, and I'm gonna find them. You just keep working.
Jesus!
If Oppie doesn't let up, he's going to implode.
He brings in someone to help solve this problem with an explosive expert. This individual I think is interesting. I think they mentioned his name at one point, but I definitely cannot pronounce this. But George Kistakowski. He's a Ukrainian.
That's good, yeah.
He's a Ukrainian chemist. He was actually involved in the bomb project, but off-site somewhere else for a while. He was brought in to be the closer on the lens, but he came in late. So Seth and another scientist, or I think it was another Army officer, were at each other's heads to get this project done. And he kind of comes in at the last second and it's like, I think I got an idea, but they didn't really welcome him all that much. So even within the scientific community, there was a little bit of conflict. But what he really brought into the fold here was he decided, what if we start building casings and actually using new manufacturing techniques to make the high explosive setup more precise. And it turns out that was the trick. So they decided, we'll go ahead and this will work. And they test it, and it does work. Unfortunately for Oppenheimer, pretty much at the same time, he gets this telegram that says that Jean Tatlock had committed suicide. But the interesting thing that also happens is that Groves gets a message too. He gets a message, an urgent message from Germany. It's coded, it seems like. Mother had no baby, not ever pregnant. Doctors pronounce her infertile. Which he realizes is code for the fact that Germany never really had a bomb project. They weren't really close to building the bomb. They had some heavy water producing facilities, which you need to be able to generate plutonium, but they weren't anywhere near that project. It's fascinating. I don't want to get into it too much here, but we covered this on 2 previous podcast episodes we did. So if you're interested in that, check out an episode we did on a Star Trek episode called City at the Edge of Forever, and the Amazon show The Man in the High Castle.
Because we always talk about that when we talk to high school students. We started the Manhattan Project in response to Germany, and it turns out Germany was never close to the bomb.
Yeah.
Right. So those are great.
Japan was probably closer than Germany was, but still not too close. But so Groves doesn't tell anybody about this.
Sir, is it wise? Suppressing this.
Well, you tell me, Colonel. It's delicate stuff. Give out my long hairs, my prima donnas. Take Hitler out of the equation. I might just run out of stink. We can give this country the biggest stick in the playground. And I intend to do that.
And even gets to the point where Germany surrenders. The scientists are trying to figure out, hey, look, victory is secured. We're partying. We're having celebrations. Do we still need to continue to build the bomb when the person who we thought we were going to have to use it against, we have to race them to, is no longer there? But Groves and Oppenheimer, they talk about this thing. They literally dance for a little while and dance around this issue. And Groves says, no, we need to build the bomb.
Make them work. And you got something. An irresistible something. Just the threat. And they're ours. Sometimes, just standing here, I keep wondering, are we working on them, or are they working on us? Give them dignity, Doctor. Then we can start talking about who can do what and what they mean.
Ed Teller, who was heavily involved in the pushing for the hydrogen bomb, the thermonuclear bomb. He was one of the people who came up with the design for that. He says that the scientists want to have the talk about the bomb. There's people like Leo Szilard. He has a petition trying to get scientists to be on the record for morally opposing the bomb. As you mentioned earlier, they want to just test it. They don't want to actually use it against the only target that's left here, which is Japan. How does this debate look in the movie?
I thought it was a really interesting debate, and at Oppenheimer's house, scientists were arguing about it, and there were some who were saying it was immoral to go forward. There were others who were saying we should just test it for posturing purposes, and others were okay with using it. I think what's most indicative is if you look at the nuclear non-proliferation community now, there are so many organizations created by these scientists who were critical in creating nuclear technology, saw what it could do, and immediately worked to prevent its use. And I think the movie covered that a little bit, but not entirely in terms of the scientists' apprehension with the thing that they created. And you can really see the tension within that, because when Groves finds out, he is less than pleased at the scientists, and it's kind of, Groves basically tells them to stay in their lane, and they're there to make the technology, and the military's there to decide whether or not it's used.
Don't waste the $2 billion that we spent on this.
Exactly. And so I think that was really interesting, but I wish there had been a little bit more about it in the movie, because that's something that definitely has transcended time and continues now, and you have that tension between whose responsibility is it, who's taking the moral responsibility for nuclear weapons and their production, their use, and things like that, but also how do you deal with it? How do you integrate the conversation?
Yeah, Groves doesn't want this debate to keep going. He learns as well that Japan is thinking about surrendering, not unconditionally. So he's excited about that, because that means that it will be a little bit more time before the U.S. accepts anything. So he tells his team to push harder on Oppenheimer, use those communist roots and things like that, where put the squeeze on him a little bit, make him like the Clementine, so that Oppenheimer will pressure on everybody else. I
think it's interesting because from the get-go, there's this conversation sort of at the beginning where all the secrecy is taking place, and Oppenheimer comes to Groves in the movie and says, we're scientists, we thrive on having these conversations, we need to be able to work together, not separately, if we're going to achieve this in the time that you wanted. And Groves kind of gives into that. In the same way, you can imagine that if you're having these kind of intellectual conversations, that's also where people start to pop up and say, what the hell are we doing? I mean, is this a good idea? Do we have to do this? And they really gloss over in the movie the fact that the United States originally pursued the technology because Germany, we thought, was also pursuing the technology. I mean, it's a snippet in the movie. It kind of mentions it, but then it sort of glosses over the fact that is not even an issue anymore, and now the only person or the only country now that we need to be worrying about is Japan. And there isn't even a dialogue really delving into the change in the dynamics that had happened now. I think they do a good job of just parsing the surface of what's happening here, but it comes back to what Erin and I have talked about before, which is how do you talk about all the different complexities of the issues of nuclear weapons from the beginning all the way to the end and all the way to where we are right now. There's just so many angles and facets to this conversation and to the debate, and I don't know how you can even get into it in its depth and entirety. But they didn't do the world's best job.
No, I think the closest they get was at one point Michael says, I've got a brother who's fighting in the Philippines. This would be a great way to bring him home. But speaking of Michael, this is where we get into a pretty difficult scene. I think this is one of the best scenes in the movie. Is Michael, he does what they call the they mentioned it previously. They called it the tickling the dragon's tail test. The first one you see where he drops a piece of uranium down, that was a different test, the drop test. But the actual test itself here, I'll describe it really quickly, is he's got two spheres, right? Spheres of, do they say it? It's spheres of beryllium, which are things that you can use to reflect neutrons. And he's got a subcritical mass of plutonium in the middle. And he's holding these spheres separate from each other, because if you close them together, you get lots of critical reactions and it releases radiation, which you don't want. You just want a little bit. So he's got two long screwdrivers, which is not the proper test protocol. He's supposed to be using an entirely different tool. We'll get into in a second why he's doing that. He's trying to hold them a little bit. He's trying to just fine-tune the gadget. How much neutrons get released when you have this level of material. Someone drops a cup of coffee.
Let it go!
It startles him. The sphere partially closes, releases a ton of radiation. Michael takes it with his hand and pulls it off so that everything stops. And there's this very, I think, a crazy moment where he says, everybody stop. Here's some chalk. Mark where you are in the room and leave.
Nobody move! Don't anybody move! Damn it! Take out everything metal. Drop to the floor. Mark the position you're standing in. Get out.
And he stays and calculates the fact that, okay, I'm dead. Everyone else is fine. And he really saved everybody by pulling that off and stopping the reaction. It was only, 2-3 seconds, pretty much?
Everybody should make it. Except me. I'm dead.
And this does reflect something that did happen. In the movie, this is before we've tested the nuclear bomb. In real life, there was a famous Los Alamos researcher named Louis Slotin. It's happened in real life after the Trinity Test. I think it was in May of 46. He did this test a bunch of times, often in his cowboy boots, jeans. He was known for being someone who really pushed the envelope. Because they're in frontier land, they might as well get the work done, but not necessarily as safely. This happens. He builds a little fort of tungsten blocks, which help to cover and shield you from the radiation. But it's happened the same thing as it does in the movie. There was a quick flash of light after a screwdriver slipped, less than a few tenths of a second. There were 3 quadrillion fission reactions, and he received 2,100 REM of radiation. 500 is enough to kill you, and that's what happens to Luis in real life about 9 days later from the radiation sickness. After this happened in real life, they decided to change the procedure. The personnel are now kept a quarter mile away from the plutonium instead of right up on it. And the kind of the sad precursor to this is that Enrico Fermi, who we see a lot in the movie, he saw this happen, like when he was doing the test successfully, and he said, Luis, if you keep doing this, you're going to be dead within a year, if you keep doing the experiments this way. And sure enough, that's kind of what happened. And obviously, Lauren Dern, they've started to develop a relationship. In the movie, she's really worried for Michael, and they apparently say, no one knows what's going to happen. It's the first time anyone has ever received this kind of a dose of radiation. In real life, it's obviously after the atomic bombs were dropped. Right. So he wasn't the first, but the movie shows you what happens. That's probably one of the best choices I think that they made, was showing the effects of radiation, because they couldn't do that
right
as they told the movie, because the movie ends pretty quickly after the bomb is tested.
I think it's also really interesting, though, because it is demonstrative of the fact that a lot of people didn't know truly what the effects were going to be, and there were certainly people not using precautions that we use today when we're dealing with radioactive material, because the tests that happened out at Los Alamos, which happens later, people were watching them from not that far away, just sitting on the ground, like crisscross applesauce, not thinking 2 times about it. We certainly did not realize the precautions that needed to be taken.
They put on suntan lotion.
Oh yeah,
It was like a fun date night. You go watch the bombs.
That's right.
Test it. But I think it was also indicative of how little we understood the decision to drop the bombs. Is what we didn't really understand what it meant, and those who did, didn't explain their decision per se. But I think it was really interesting how the movie depicted the lack of information we had about radiation.
We'd never even seen one of these things detonate.
Right.
Before, and that's why we're getting to the I guess this is the climax of the movie. We get to the Trinity Test site, and so Trinity is the code name for the test. And I actually never really knew why they called it Trinity. I had read this book a long time ago, but I think this thing never clicked in my head. According to Brotherhood of the Bomb by Greg Herkin, which was given to me on my last day of working at the Arms Control Association, I just realized I forgot that they gave me that book, because I opened it up and it had a little inscription, and I'm like, oh, that's really nice. According to that book, it was a secret tribute from Oppenheimer to Gene Tatlock. He says that it was based on a poem, a sonnet by John Donne, which is, batter my heart, 3-person God, for you as yet, but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, overthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. and I guess 3-person god Trinity. It's what he ended up coming up with. And that's what he told, he didn't tell him about Gene Tatlock, but he told that story about the poem eventually to Groves. You know, so we get this, I think, a really interesting shot of them assembling the test device in Alamogordo, New Mexico, so off-site now from Los Alamos, out from the outside, and you see everybody working and lowering the core, I guess, maybe the bomb assembly into the test. There wasn't an actual bomb casing, but a test device type thing. I thought that was a really cool shot.
It's a little scary how it was just duct taped together. But...
yeah, they had plenty of magical duct tape. We get this really great scene with Dr. Cox and Oppenheimer, who's confronting Oppenheimer on the petition. Hey, your friend Michael's dying. He gave you this petition. Are you going to do anything about it? Oppenheimer says no. And Dr. Cox gets really upset. He starts talking about human experiments that were conducted in real life on people who did not know what was happening. Apparently, they'll eventually start dosing people who were in hospitals and mental patients and people who they apparently had terminal illnesses. They were secretly dosed with radiation.
Now, wait a minute, goddammit, Oppenheimer. I got a friend falling apart in there who thinks you got all the answers because that's what you let him think. You did. Now, do you really know what the crisis going on in this place? Is the whole thing out of control?
If you're trying to make a particular point here, what is it?
I have spent the last 2 years of my life putting up with all your security and your secrecy and your control. And now I don't think all that bullshit was to keep what's going on in this place from the Germans or the Japanese or even the Russians. I think it's to keep it from ordinary American Jacks and Jills because they may not happen to like what's going on in this place.
Ordinary American people, they don't want to know what's going on here. The only thing that they want to know is that their sons are coming home alive, and I'm doing everything in my power to see that they do.
Like Oak Ridge, where they're injecting mentally ill and old uncomprehending people with huge doses of plutonium.
Look, I don't know anything about Oak Ridge, but if you want to ask a question about what's happening here, you ask this. Will it be big enough? Big enough to scare the hell out of all of us and make us stop and think. Big enough to stop all war forever. If you want to ask a question, you ask that.
Look at I.
He calls that out. He talks about the secrecy that's involved in the bomb project. And I think it's one of the most powerful moments in the movie is the secrecy being done to not let the Russians know about it or not let the Americans know about it, kind of what's happening. And Oppenheimer is told by Dr. Cox.
Look at I've seen Oak Ridge, all right? And that place wasn't built to make 1 or 2 bombs. It was built to make thousands of them. And pretty soon everybody's going to have a bomb. They will. And what are we going to do with them? Sit around, wait till they go off until boom, and then we got ourselves one world full of Michael Merrimans dying from the inside out. Is that what you're looking for? Because that's the future you've made for us. Oppenheimer, you ought to stop playing God, because you are not good at it, and the position is taken.
And Michael dies in a very gruesome manner kind of right after that.
Yeah, on the how gruesome Michael's death is as well. Erin and I have had conversations about how they show radiation in the HBO show Chernobyl, and it is incredibly gruesome, but at the same time I think that's one of the better things that they do in the movie that we agreed on, that it is gruesome and you need to see it. And part of the conversation that we want to explain without scaring the crap out of high school students either is not, again, to make them feel one way or another, but it is a real weapon that causes horrific effects to somebody. It's, not any weapon is bad, but what a nuclear weapon does to a human being is terrifying and terrible, and you should know that, and it shouldn't be glossed over.
And it transcends generations. Like, the effects are still seen today, and I think that's something that's also left out of the conversation. It's how do you portray that to high school students when it is so gruesome, but it is the reality, and what is the responsibility to depict that?
Well, there's so many movies, and I've seen a lot of them through this podcast, where a bomb will go off and it's like, oh yeah, that was a big bomb. But there's no sense of any of the other things that are involved in it. We talking about you working at the center. Jeff Wilson has been on our podcast a number of times, and we covered Chernobyl on it. It was a 3-hour episode where we went into that show pretty in detail. We talked about that where they do demonstrate it, and then other movies like Starship Troopers, where there are nuclear weapons that go off and they're just nothing, because that's how they were described, and it's just really kind of nothing that gets involved. It's just a big bomb. And I think hopefully people, they see this movie, and if they take anything away from it, it's radiations can be pretty dangerous. Now, don't get so scared of radiation that radiation's everywhere. It's in concrete, it's in buildings, you eat a banana. It's all about scale, but nuclear weapons, they can inflict something pretty bad, and it's long lasting.
Yeah, and the juxtaposition though of, are you keeping this secret from other countries, from the Russians, from Germany, or are you keeping it from Americans? And that whole conversation of playing God while somebody is clearly dying is a pretty strong point that they do a good job of. So.
Yeah, well, because Oppenheimer and Groves, they're single-minded. It's raining, there's thunderstorms at the test site, and they just refuse to even consider the idea of delaying the test. At one point, someone says, if there's rain and there's fallout, it's going to spread the fallout everywhere. And he says, I don't care. Fortunately, I guess, from this perspective, the weather eventually does clear up. In real life, Groves told the meteorologist on the project, when the meteorologist said you'll have a 2-hour window at this time during the day between 5 and 6 a.m., Groves told the meteorologist, I will hang you if you are incorrect. So we get our detonation. It's at 5:29 a.m. on July 16th. That's way earlier than I tend to wake up. The scientists placed bets in it ahead of time about whether or not the test would set the world on fire, literally the air, right? The nitrogen on fire. There's a local radio signal that keeps interrupting the countdown, playing some ballet music. All that stuff is true. So it's interesting little tidbits that they didn't have to invent in their head. And then we get the actual image of the test.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
What do you think about that? We get Oppenheimer, right? He looks with his crazy goggles. His mouth is vibrating because of the shockwaves that comes in. Is it compelling? What do you guys think of the tests?
I think it was a powerful image, especially with his mouth flailing over, kind of showing you the power of the air blast. But when I was watching with my dad, I was explaining, I was like, oh, there's the fireball, then there's the air radius, and going into all these details that I don't think he necessarily cared about.
It looks like there's this viral video about an older man who puts a leaf blower on his mouth, and it makes his mouth move, and while his wife in the background is like, what are you doing? It had that look to it.
That's what Oppenheimer looked like, yep.
Yeah.
It was, and I think I really did like the lead up to when they were about to drop the bomb, and they were debating whether or not the atmosphere would get set on fire, and the fact that they still did it. When they were wondering if maybe they were going to end life on Earth, but let's see what happens.
And let's put suntan lotion on first.
Yeah, just in case, we'll put some zinc on our nose, and then we'll be set. So I think that was really, really interesting.
I don't think it's really that important, but according to Oppenheimer biography called American Prometheus, he was actually lying face down in the ground outside of the command bunker about 10,000 yards from ground zero. So he wasn't in a bunker looking at a little peephole wearing goggles. A few people got actual goggles. Most people were given really thick gloves and the lens of a welder's helmet. You imagine you have a helmet and you actually have the lens in it. People were just given the lens, and they were told to put their face down. If they wanted to look at it, they had to go like this and hold it above their eyeballs. But they weren't actually given goggles or masks. I think later on you can see pictures of people wearing them, but at that time they're like, I don't know, just put this in front of your face and don't look.
I saw the testing facility in New Mexico. We drove out to the testing flats, and you can see this little patch on the side of the road where they're just these wooden stumps that people were just sat on the stumps to watch out on the field, and it just seems so like you're just watching a baseball game from afar or something. And it's actually mind-blowing because there are these entire conversations going on, taking bets of are you going to light the world on fire, what's going to happen, are we all going to die? You have no idea, just straight up wild card what's going to happen, but you just let people sit on these wooden stones to just it's crazy.
Well, this is what an army general who saw Oppenheimer as this took place. Here's what he saw in Oppenheimer's face. For the last few seconds, he stared directly ahead, and when the announcer shouted, "Now!" there came a tremendous burst of light, followed by, shortly thereafter, the deep growling roar of the explosion. Oppenheimer's face relaxed into an expression of tremendous relief. I guess his brother Frank said that he doesn't remember exactly what Oppenheimer said afterwards, but I think it was it worked. And then they got all excited. They started passing around bottles of whiskey and champagne, and had a pretty good day. Of course, the movie shows this essentially like a championship parade. I mean, people who live in Washington, D.C. have been experiencing a lot of championship parades recently. It looked like that to me. I mean, he's on a Jeep, and they're kind of putting their hands out like they just won something. While, in contrast, Laura Dern and Dr. Cox are starting to release the birds and other test animals that they were doing testing on while reflecting on the loss of Michael. So it's an interesting little back and forth. I think at one point Groves and Oppenheimer congratulate each other with a little fist bump and a nod, and the movie ends on that very positive note. There's two quick things at the end. There's just closing text. It says that there was the bombing of Japan, that Oppenheimer opposed the hydrogen bomb, the super, but was stripped of his security clearance. He died of cancer in 1967. Groves lost control of the nuclear arms program, but he was a business executive until he died of heart disease in 1970. And that's how the movie ends.
I was really surprised that they didn't include Oppenheimer's quote, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds."
I thought there was an incredible amount of restraint.
Right.
They didn't do that. Apparently he said that in an interview. I was surprised to not see him just say it.
I thought they would have closed with at the end when they kind of had those clips about what happened later. But then the movie just ended. I was like, I think this is the first thing about Oppenheimer that has not included that quote.
Yeah, Oppenheimer was a big, in addition to science, he read a lot of like Eastern philosophy, and that's from the Gita. Yeah, it's fascinating that they didn't put that in there. So that's the movie. Let's. I have a few things to talk about that I'd love to get your thoughts on about the kind of the nuke plots overall. We'll talk a little bit about the actual movie itself, and then we'll wrap up. So the first question I had was, how well do you think, Kate, that the movie portrays the actual Manhattan Project overall? Obviously, it focuses pretty much exclusively at Los Alamos, doesn't really care what happens at Oak Ridge and Hanford. If anything, though, what work that was done there, and I'm not trying to butter you up and your grandfather, but like the work done at those sites were equally, if not more important than the actual work that was done at Los Alamos, because the material continues today to be the big barrier.
Yeah, well, I think overall they did a pretty good job of staying close to what was happening in the Manhattan Project, especially at Los Alamos. I think it was an interesting decision in telling the story, because the story is really about the making of the two bombs, and it's not just about what's happening at Los Alamos. It's about the entire story, which, as you've noted several times, happened across the United States in several different areas. But
it was one of the large. They had to essentially build a manufacturing industry.
Right. They don't talk about Oak Ridge. They don't talk about Chicago. They don't talk about Hanford. But at the same time, it was a $30 million budget. It only made $3 million. It's probably a good thing that they didn't try and go too many places, because it is a really complicated story to tell, and there are a lot of moving parts to it. So I do think they tried to just pick this one sort of concentrated area to focus on. That said, it amazed me because I didn't find it that entertaining of a movie in general, and I couldn't figure out why, because the Manhattan Project and the building of the nuclear weapon is a fascinating story. It is one of the most interesting stories that requires no dramatization at all. It's a fascinating story, and yet somehow after 2 hours of the movie, I was like, okay. And that's not really how you should feel afterwards, and I can't figure out why I didn't think it was a phenomenal movie, because it had a lot of the parts of a good movie, and the story was like primed to be a phenomenal one, but it just didn't hit for me.
Erin, how do you think the movie overall portrayed the Manhattan Project?
I have very similar feelings to Kate. We were sharing our hot takes over text while we were watching the movie together.
I want to get on these hot takes.
Very quippy. I had high hopes as a nuclear nerd for a nuclear film, and I also struggled with why I wasn't engrossed in the film. And I think it was this weird tension between giving not enough information about some things and too much about others. It's just how they spent their time was not super productive towards creating this cohesive story. And I think focusing on Oppenheimer is fascinating because it demonstrates the tension between like communists and Americans before it even became the larger issue of the US-Soviet Union competition with nuclear weapons. But yet somehow everything was just kind of touched on and not really explained. And so I think it could have been a better illustration of what was a truly fascinating time in our history and something that has implications today. And I think that could have been improved upon.
So this movie seems to me to be the kind of film that maybe if I wrote a movie, because the guy who wrote this film, one of the screenwriters, Bruce Richardson, who also wrote Killing Fields and a number of kind of really big films. So he was asked to write a movie about the Manhattan Project, and he was given a novel. I can't figure out what novel it was, but he said it was so bad and terrible in terms of accuracy. It even had instead of Oppenheimer, it was they called it like Bramberger, because they didn't want to. He's like, it's so far away. They clearly wanted to make up stuff. He's like, he threw it away and he did his own research. He says that he did more research and read more about the atomic bomb than anyone else in the world. And he wrote this story, and he wanted to tell two main things. One, he wanted to show a story where Leslie Groves was not meant to be like a bumbling fool, which he claims this, a lot of things have told that story. You get the brilliant scientist and you got the grunt who's yelling at them and arguing. And he says, no, look, he mentions a BBC miniseries called Oppenheimer that stars Sam Waterston as Oppenheimer. He says that portrayed Groves as a bumbling idiot. He says Groves has built the Pentagon. The guy is no idiot. He is highly intelligent, incredibly capable, and this is important, very devious. The Richardson does not like Groves, because the main hook that he wanted to tell this story was the quote, the race for the atomic bomb between Nazi Germany and the Allied powers was BS. There was no arms race. And his argument is that Germany was never close, Japan was never close, but that information only came after he was able to spend thousands of dollars from Warner Brothers and Paramount Pictures to FOIA all of this stuff. And that was his argument, was that the bomb project was built on the lie of we need to build now, but we know that for years prior to the actual start of the project that this was never along. So that was Richardson's, I think, his hook for this movie to try to make it interesting was that now we know that the bomb project itself was based off of some false premises. Maybe that was what he thought was interesting. And maybe today in 2020, when we're watching this movie and we're like, oh, we know the history. We know that they were never that far along. Maybe that's why it's not as interesting. So a lot of this stuff is real and you throw it together, but it's not very focused and overall maybe not a story that holds up over time.
I think what they really need is like a Lin-Manuel Miranda to kind of take a look at the Manhattan Project and just make a new film. It has so much potential. I think you should include all the nuances of different stories, as you mentioned. But there's just something that didn't fully
about it.
click.
I don't know if partly I feel like I have pretty high expectations now just because of where film and TV has gone
and the cast of this movie. I mean, it stars Paul Newman.
Yes, I mean it's a phenomenal cast and the acting was great. I mean, it wasn't even like that. It was unbelievable because there was just such bad acting. That was certainly not the case. But partly, I think I just kept envisioning what the film would look like if we were making it today, or what I would add, or what I would have changed. And I was annoyed with how much we also, in our hot takes, we're talking about kind of how sexist the movie was in a lot of ways. And as two younger women in the field, who focus now on bringing next-gen women into the field and caring about this issue, this is certainly not a film that you want to show those people because it does a terrible job of depicting the role of women.
I mean, that's why the movie is called Fat Man, a little bit.
Right.
Apparently, his joke on that was, well, Fat Man is Leslie Groves, who was between 250 to 300 pounds, and Little Boy was the little bitty obedient Oppenheimer who would just do whatever Groves wanted. So that's why he called it that, was because he thought that, those were the model. It wasn't about the bombs. He was talking about the two characters themselves. I mean, well, let's get into that. How well do you, I mean, you already answered this question. What do you think the movie does justice to the role of women that were involved in the project? Because certainly the largest players were the people they talked about, but they weren't the only ones, and they could have shown something. You mentioned the book, The Girls of Atomic City by Denise Kiernan. Great book on that history. But there's a bunch of people they could have mentioned that were involved in the project.
There were also just women scientists. I mean, there were certainly less women scientists and physicists, but there were certainly women scientists and physicists who are doing this work, who were in the room, and they were never shown at the cocktail parties. They were never shown in any of the scenes, not even as a background person.
Nothing.
They showed them as wives and they showed them as nurses, and there were even some quotes that I thought were fairly degrading. The one by Leslie Groves about women being courageous enough to stand in the background when it was, Marie Curie who first came first with her husband in the article published that they found radium, or were able to isolate radium. And that, I mean, to leave an entire 50% of the world out of this conversation, when it is true there were less women involved in the project, and there are still less women involved in STEM today than I think many people would like, but it seemed like an almost purposeful depiction or choice to leave them out.
There could have been you don't need a ton, to tell that story if that's really what you wanted to focus on. You could do some stuff. You could mention Diz Riddle Graves, who was a physicist who basically created the neutron reflector at the weapon's core. She was at Los Alamos. She was even 7 months pregnant while prepping the test site. Wouldn't that have been an interesting visual to put into the movie? Or Naomi Livesey, who was a mathematician who, was using those IBM computers, like
the Calutron girls.
Yeah, that would have been super cool to have there. That was obviously a big movie that came out a couple years ago.
Of the women at NASA?
Yeah, the rocket scientists.
Hidden Figures.
Hidden Figures. So clearly that story is super interesting. It can be done well. You could have 1 or 2 characters there, and also would have been kind of a fun, hey, look what computers were like back then type thing. That would have been something you could have also added if you didn't want to focus on this story. Just, I don't know, just really interesting. The only female characters are Jean Tatlock, Kitty, and Catherine.
Yep. I think there's also, as you said, there were so many opportunities. It didn't have to be a whole other subplot. It could just be a quick depiction to kind of mention the role of women. But I was really frustrated about the fact that women were just seen as either being courageous enough to step back or actively undermining the project because you have to support the men and let the men work.
Right. And
they were either communists trying to steal secrets from the men or people who were trying to make the men distracted by their familiar priorities.
Yeah. I think it was interesting, though, because they allude to how difficult it is to bring people to these sites in the middle of nowhere. They were purposefully chosen as sites basically in the middle of nowhere, and plenty of people had to uproot their families and bring them there. And I guarantee you that there were a lot of women who, were also doing their duty to their country to come with their husbands or come themselves to the projects. I was reading an article about how couples who both had skills were prized at Manhattan Project sites to have both the man and the woman who could work at the Manhattan Project site. It was like a double whammy if you could get them both. And why wasn't that one part of the conversation?
Yeah.
So. I think we should just remake it, and we should add some of those in.
So I haven't seen the Manhattan TV series that's on WGN, I think. I know that Lily, I think her name is Lily Bylock, who also helped to write a number of big episodes of The Leftovers TV show that has nuke scenes. She was one of the main writers on Manhattan, and she consulted with a bunch of the nuclear people in our community. I want to see Manhattan. I don't have access to the show to be able to get it, but maybe at some point. I've
never seen it either.
But I'm pretty sure there's some top-level characters in that show that are also women, and I don't think they're like wives. I think they're involved in the project itself. It's like a semi-biographical story. I think there's an Oppenheimer, but maybe they don't call him that. Kind of a thing. So I don't know. Yeah. I can't recommend it because I haven't seen it, but
is it still on? Sorry.
No, it's all gone. I think it only lasted a season or two.
A season or two, yeah. It looked good.
Would you recommend this movie after we've kind of talked all about it as a teaching tool? Maybe as at least a movie that's out there, or would you think it does more harm than good and you'd rather someone watch a documentary instead?
Trying to inspire the next generation to get involved, I wouldn't say that this is the film that I would pick. Because I think, as we said, the Manhattan Project is incredibly fascinating, and this doesn't necessarily capture that. But I think for me, it's interesting in the sense of learning more about the relationship between Oppenheimer and Groves, the scientists in general, and the tension between facilitating dialogue within scientists to create new ideas and trying to manage security and information and scientists versus the military. I think it starts to touch on all of those points, which is really interesting, and they're important nuances to understand. But I think if you're looking for something to inspire others to get involved, especially those who don't have as much of a background, this might not be the film for that.
I totally agree. I think there are clips from it which would be interesting to show and then to spark a dialogue.
Like the tickling the dragon.
The debate between whether or not they should be using it and continue. I mean, there are certainly little snippets of it that bring up really interesting conversations that you could have. I think if you're teaching the next generation this, the things that you need to do are make it interesting, make it relevant, and make it personal. And this movie does have a lot of those elements. It's just I don't walk away being inspired by it, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's also the best teaching tool in terms of giving you all the information that you might need. So probably wouldn't be my first choice, but
I want a 5-part Chernobyl-style Manhattan story. Not a a multiple season show.
No.
Or even this BBC 10-part miniseries. Just make it good, 5 episodes.
100%.
You can cover all this stuff fairly well enough.
Well, the part that you were talking when we were going over, the gun barrel versus the implosion. The best, this is getting back into the Chernobyl HBO series, but the episode at the end of Chernobyl where the scientist is walking through what happened, just step by step, is the best 10 minutes of television explaining the most complicated thing. Just in plain terms that is easy to understand. That's what I wanted when they were talking about the gun barrel versus implosion. That's what you need. I need a diagram, not an orange. The orange was not doing it for me.
No, the orange did. Also he didn't even show him hold the orange and then pop it. It was done off camera, and then he has a squeezed orange in his hand.
It was a chaotic moment.
Yeah. You're first wondering, why is your hand leaking? And then you're like, oh, okay, here's what the science of it is. Well, before we get into the rating system of our movie, do you have favorite Nuke movies? If you want to call them that, things that you do actually enjoy that have a nuclear plot to them?
Gosh, I feel like that is so sad because I really don't. I really don't have one thing that is my absolute favorite. But
nuclear pop culture is not part of your. And that's fine. I find that interesting, but also I completely understand that.
Yeah, I think books. There are certainly books that I have read that have done a better job for me of, either inspiring me or having sort of these internal dialogues and conversations. I've had that experience more with books than I have had with pop culture, which just makes me want more of it. I do want the 5-part Chernobyl series that explains the Manhattan Project, and I easily think it's a phenomenal story that is interesting and should be told, so I'm still waiting for it.
I think you have to seek them out, and I think that is also difficult when you have to actually search for these nuclear related pop culture things, because
or there's
in this niche environment, and even I'm like, oh, where is that?
Yeah, shows that sort of tangentially talk about them, because I do feel like now that I'm in the field, I do from time to time watch an episode of something where it'll pop up in the background, but it won't be the main point of the show, or it won't be a really in-depth conversation. It just is there, and so maybe that sparks people's interest enough, but it's not doing a good enough job of focusing on what that thing is and then telling the story wholeheartedly.
Well, all you have to do is hear a political speech these days when someone says, we need a Manhattan Project for this.
Right.
Manhattan Project for education, Manhattan Project for roads. And then if people don't understand what the Manhattan Project is, if they haven't used one of your learning modules and figured that out, then hopefully people know it's a term that you know, but we don't necessarily know what the context of it is. So let's rate the movie. I like to use a consistent 1 to 5 scale so I can be, consistent across all the content we cover for the podcast. Because I get super critical about the movie, I also like to tailor the rating system scale. So what I've done is I've used my chalkboard, I've crunched the math, and I've come up with a scale of 1 to 5 sides of a Pentagon cake. If you have just one side and you smash it to the ground in a fit of rage at your new job responsibilities, you don't have any cake left over. If you have a full 5-sided Pentagon cake, you can smash one of them and still eat the other 4 while watching reruns of your favorite show while lifting your spirits. Real quick here, I gave this movie a 2. Sorry that I recommended it to you all to watch. I do like Newman's acting, but I feel like both Newman and Schultz are very miscast. Tend to look like the actual characters themselves. Groves is mostly grunting and yelling on the phone. It doesn't really get into things all that much other than kind of an angry military guy. It fails with Kitty and a lot of the other characters. It does a good job with Michael, but man, I just wish we talked about this. I just wish there was a little bit more there. I agree with you. I'd recommend scenes. Kate, I wouldn't recommend the whole show itself. But what do you?
2 is probably where I would come in at. There are certainly things that it does well. It covers some really important parts of the Manhattan Project, and it gets most things right. I'm trying to explain certain things to my family or friends, and we're watching this movie. I wouldn't have to correct a bunch of parts of the movie, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
It kills me the fact that they just leave out such critical, important roles of women, almost to an extent where they're doing a disservice to include any women at all, to be honest. And I think it just told too much and not enough. Exactly what Erin said earlier. It missed some things in a movie that easily could have been super fascinating, and for some reason, it just wasn't.
Erin, how do you feel about it?
I also am going to go with a 2 because I would like some cake to comfort me while I watch my other favorite TV shows. Because I really struggled with how women were portrayed in the film. And I know it's from 1989, but still. I was very frustrated with that. And I think it did assume a lot of knowledge on the part of the audience. And I think if you're trying to elucidate what the Manhattan Project actually was, it's really important to provide the critical foundational information, including what materials were being used and why, and maybe a diagram of the gun-type device. And so I think that could have been done. But as Kate said, it's really useful that you don't really have to correct too much, because I think it's better to have done it this way than to have given a false history, because I think that's also not useful for educational purposes.
Well, if someone maybe hear all these 2s ratings and go, I don't want to see this movie, I want to see something else. Do you have anything else you want to recommend to people that listening that may want to experience something similar, or just want to learn more about either the work that maybe that you do or the work on the Manhattan Project? I've got 3 quick things. One is a 1989 TV movie called Day One on CBS. Stars Brian Dennehy and as Leslie Groves. It won an Emmy for Outstanding Drama and Comedy Series, and it also has Tony Shalhoub as Enrico Fermi. It's not great, but it's weirdly better, and there are more female characters in the movie. Not a lot, but
it's a low bar.
There are more, yeah. I recommend as well a book by Robert Serber, who is a scientist on the Manhattan Project. He was the guy who, when you showed up as a new scientist at Los Alamos, he would do the Los Alamos primer. He would give a lecture about everything that they happened to know on how to build an atomic bomb at the beginning. And this book came out in 1992. And you can get it, and it's just a straight lecture that he gave with a little bit of notes on where they thought the bomb project was and what the questions were to move forward. I don't understand 70% of it, but it's very interesting to see as a historical document. Here you're about to start your job. Here's the things you need to know, at least to get on the same page as everybody else. And finally, I recommend just a great book by Richard Rhodes called The Making of the Atomic Bomb from 1986. So it came out a few years before this movie. It is one of the better books overall on the history of the bomb project.
I was actually just gifted that book.
Oh, nice. Enjoy.
It's on my list.
It's a heavy book. It's pretty big. But if you like that one, he did, I think, 3 more. Dark Sun about the hydrogen bomb, and then Arsenals of Folly and other ones. Yeah, a couple other ones he's done. They get smaller each time. What about you, Erin? Do you have anything you want to recommend to people?
I would definitely, mine are book related. The Girls of Atomic City, which we've talked about previously. I think that was a really interesting look at the role women played in the Manhattan Project, but also just the role of everyday civilians who uprooted their lives and moved from all over America to these remote locations that were strategically picked so that Russia or the Soviet Union or other foes of the state would not be able to find them. And so they were truly in the middle of nowhere, and now there's towns that sprouted up around them. By the time people really gave up quite a bit, and it was interesting to learn more about the everyday life at a Manhattan Project site. And
that's
then
Denise
also,
Kiernan? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then John Hersey's Hiroshima was really interesting, and I think very valuable to kind of understand what happened after we dropped the bombs and what the discussion of whether or not we should, and the outcome that we did twice, what that meant for people who were actually living in Japan. I think that's a really important perspective to hold on to. That's
great, because the movie does end before really get into that. So that's be good follow on. Kate, got anything for us?
Yeah, so Day One is also, that's a good choice, so thanks for mentioning that one. There's a book called Plutopia by Kate Brown, and I really like that. It's an accurate historical comparison of the pursuit of nuclear weapons both in the U.S. and then in the USSR. That book is really interesting for me because it also talks about Hanford, which again is where I'm from, and it also talks about a winery, which my family also has. So I find it to be pretty interesting, and it's just very well done and fascinating all the same.
Reminds me of Oppenheimer liked to say that he had 2 favorite loves, physics and the desert. And he was looking for a way to combine those 2 things. And it happened to be like, go to Los Alamos and build a bomb.
That's hilarious. And then these are just two quick plugs. You know, if you're looking for educational tools, I think that Girl Security, if you're a little younger and you're listening to us and you're in middle school or in high school, or even know somebody who's in middle school or high school and is interested, you should definitely reach out to Girl Security. As Erin mentioned earlier, we're working on a nuclear module that will be available at some point if you wanted to. And then I'm working on this other side project. It's a website called highlyenriched.com.
Nice.
We're still in alpha phase, but it will be also sort of crowdsourced experiential learning and curricula that you can use, that's content created by other people as well, but available for sort of all beginner stage levels from high school and college students. So
great. Well, if you need a list of some good Nuke movies to watch as part of that curriculum, I've got you covered. But that sounds fascinating. I know another person who's on your Girl Security board, Jamie Withorn. She's come on the podcast before. She's been a guest, and Jamie's got this great website she's been building, learnwmd.com, which provides a lot of great resources as well. So I think between all of this, if you've made it this far in the episode and you want to learn more, those are some great things to check out. So Kate, Erin, thanks very much again. Where can people find some more other than Girl Security? Where can people find more of your work? Maybe your Twitter handles if you want to share those, or anything you got in terms of how people to follow your work.
You can find me at Blonde Nuke Girl on Twitter.
And you can find me at Erin_Con17.
CONN17.
Yes.
Great. Well, thanks very much again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It's been awesome.
Happy New Year 2020.
Thanks for checking off the first thing on my goals for 2020.
Resolution's done. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, or you want to tell us what we got wrong, either about the movie or about maybe you live next to Los Alamos and we got this entire thing wrong, please let us know. A couple ways you can do that. Twitter at Nuclear Podcast. We're also on Facebook. We have an email account, supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. Our website, supercriticalpodcast.com, has got a good number of resources on each episode, the things that we do to build this particular episode you just heard, as well as other contacts and things like that. And also I finally put up my list of 300 plus Nuke movies and TVs that I've been building. So if you just want to see how much stuff's out there, you can see that list as well. Until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer.
And Erin.
Kate.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we are bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one.
I love